Hello everyone, thank you for joining me again for the continuation of my review of my recent debate with Matt Dillahunty on the resurrection of Jesus. You'll be glad to know that the audio quality is much better this time. Again, I am joined by my friend and colleague Dr. Timothy McGrew, an expert in epistemology and probability theory and the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Western Michigan University. This time I'm also joined by another friend, Richard Porter, who is an apologist who has done work for Apologetics 315, Ratio Christi, and several other major apologetic ministries. We will pick up the debate approximately where we left off in part 2.
It can be edited out.
Yeah. And I uploaded in two parts segments from our conversation last time as well. And these have been quite popular. I've had quite a lot of good feedback from that. Sorry about the poor audio quality, by the way. I didn't realize my Blue Yeti mic was plugged in. It just wasn't, for some reason, Zoom has selected the wrong microphone, which it doesn't normally do. But, so it was using the computer's internal microphone. So my audio quality wasn't great, but tonight it should be better. Okay, so I've started the recording, and yeah, if there's anything that if there's any thing in the recording that you're not happy with and that you don't want to be used, then just tell me, and I will make sure that it doesn't go on YouTube.
All right. There's this thing about Jonathan's fake background he's using. Sometimes it blanks out pieces of his coffee cup or of his chair. You can see the chair wobbling in and out of existence there.
Oh man.
Oh yeah. So and the
no, that was the microphone actually. Yeah.
In the comments on the YouTube video for the Dillahunty debate, a lot of atheists thought that they'd uncovered some massive revelation that I was using a fake background, which Dillahunty was also using a fake background.
Shocker.
Did they think that impugned your case, or?
Apparently. All right. So I'm going to pick up approximately where we left off last time, slightly before.
This is where the bad gets even worse.
Yeah.
And this is why we need you here, Richard. We need you to keep us from just going bonkers.
I'm here to suffer with you.
All right.
Solidarity.
Everyone can see this?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I mean, yeah, sure. I wouldn't just do that. But that doesn't mean that I'm just going to put the volume up here in a second.
Also, Jonathan, you speak kind of quickly, so if you could dial back the speed up.
Okay.
Yeah, to maybe 1.25 or something.
Okay.
That'll help.
Okay. I mean, yeah, sure. I wouldn't dispute that. But that doesn't mean that they weren't reliable or truthful reporters.
I know, but that also doesn't mean they are. That's my point. I'm not saying that they're not reliable. I'm saying you don't get to assume they are.
Right. But the point is that when you consider numerous instances of verification of the Gospels between themselves, the way they interlock in a casual and subtle way, the way that they intersect with extra-biblical secular sources, I could discuss many of those, that provides a prima facie basis for trusting them on issues that we cannot directly cross-check them on, because it shows that they're close up to the facts and that they are substantially trustworthy and reliable in the reportage of the events they talk about.
Yeah, that'll never fly. I love my mother, and my mother has sent me letters, essentially telling me that she wouldn't lie to me, and God is real and Jesus is real. I don't believe my mother's lying to me. I just believe she's wrong. I believe she's sincerely conveying information that she's wrong about, because so in the case of this, you're wanting to say that somebody's reliable when you have no access to that person at all, other than here's something they wrote, something fairly small that they wrote, that you can't go out and investigate. You can't determine the truth of any of it. So you don't know how reliable they are in the parts that you can't.
Okay, let's just stop this again. I think we saw some of this before, but let's stop this again and let's just note that there are multiple wheels coming off the Dillahunty bus at this point. One of them is that, of course, we can check numerous things to determine whether they're true. And this is biblical interpretation 101. Of course, there are points that we can cross-check with the Gospels, with the book of Acts, even with Paul's letters. Numerous points. In the case of Acts, hundreds of points that we can cross-check. And we can cross-check these with archaeology, with other historians, with numismatic data from coins. This is not the case that we can't check things. Second, the parallel with his mother is to her asserting things that are not things that she has seen and heard. Whereas what we're talking about now is the attestation of things that they had seen and heard, right? The beginning of 1 John, that which our hands have handled concerning the word of life. This is a matter where they were claiming to be close up to the facts. Now, the claim itself by itself isn't necessarily true, but you have to give an account of the fact that they made these claims about empirically verifiable events. And that's what Matt is trying to dodge here. He's trying to dodge away from saying, all right, this is why they said X. And he needs to come to terms with the fact that they're making a claim is a datum that requires explanation. He wants to waffle back and forth between saying, I don't have to give an explanation of it, and saying, well, the explanation is that they were making it up and that's just as good as your explanation. And of course, whether that is just as good as your explanation depends on a lot of factors. Depends on what they've said, depends on whether there are other interlocking kinds of things with other things they've said that provide a case that they are, as you say, close up to the facts, habitually truthful. So there are just so many things wrong in such a short passage here. Oh, another thing, the Gospels are not really all that short. They're not like a 2-page deposition. They provide us with a fairly broad canvas on which they're talking about a lot of things Jesus is supposed to have said and done. And that is why we have the opportunities both for external and for internal corroboration and confirmation. So that was remarkable. Go, Richard, yeah.
I was just going to say, Tim, you might want to, you might be able to expand upon this. It seems to me, and you as well, Jonathan, it seems to me that every time you bring up a data point, it's almost as if he wants to say that you want to make this data point and then make a beeline for the resurrection. When you're taking the resurrection, let's say the resurrection is at the center, you're building the concentric circles around the resurrection. And it just seems like every time you brought up some sort of data point, whether it's an undesigned coincidence or whatever the case may be, it's, well, that doesn't get you the truth of Christianity. That doesn't get, and at no point did you claim that was the case. Often you were, I mean, I probably count on both hands how many times you said, Matt, it's a cumulative argument, it's an inductive argument, and yet every time it was just this quick shift from, oh, but that doesn't get you this. Well, it's not meant to, Matt. That's the point.
I think there's a major failure to understand the nature of a cumulative case, any cumulative case. Using Dillahunty's methodology, we could pick apart pretty much any testimonial case for anything, unless we had a monument with an inscription on it, at which point Dillahunty would say, well, the inscription is just a claim, so we don't have to pay any attention to that. You know, at a certain point, one needs to just call a halt and say, we've got faulty epistemology here. We need to go back and we need to start over again. None of this is going to fly.
Passover thing, even though it's coincidentally reported.
Well, we do, because I just showed the way they interlock casually, so it points to the truth of the narrative.
No, it doesn't. It does not. It does not confirm that that's what's actually happened. Are you saying that 4 people couldn't get something wrong?
No, but that's not the argument.
Okay.
But the argument is that they fit together in a casual way. So, for example, Mark and John seem to be independent on this. So Mark telescopes the narrative. It's John that gives us the extra detail.
Stop. Couldn't. Look at this. Time out here.
Flag on the play.
Oh, I mean, look at the move from it doesn't confirm it to, are you saying they couldn't get it wrong, right? Just shifting back and forth. It's like ultra rapid moving of the goalposts here, shifting back and forth between a claim that there's not even confirmation going on. And I am now persuaded that Dillahunty doesn't really have a grasp of what confirmation is, and saying, well, it doesn't absolutely eliminate the possibility of error. Of course, confirmation is not supposed to eliminate the possibility of error. It eliminates the probability of error. It reduces the probability of error to minuscule proportions in extreme cases. And that's just something he's shifting back and forth on. That this is maddening to watch, because he's committing these moves so rapidly. This is one of the reasons that verbal debates are not optimal places to get at the truth. Sometimes there's a good reason for doing them anyway, but you have someone who's just squirreling like this, and as long as he interrupts you enough times and talks loudly enough, people watching won't really track with what's going on. And he's a great one for interrupting while you're trying to talk. We've seen that in clip after clip after clip.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to say that's why Matt Dillahunty will only really agree to conversational style debates, because it can behave like he does in the Atheist Experience program and just keep interrupting you enough so that you can't actually get your points fully developed.
Jonathan, did he answer a single point, a single data point that you made?
I don't believe he did, no.
I don't think he answered a single one.
I think that was on purpose. I think the point was to deny that there was anything to answer,
Sure.
thereby relieving him of the burden of having actually to engage with evidence. If you just say, well, there isn't any evidence, so I don't have to engage, then it makes it seem, for those who don't know what's going on, like you've scored some kind of point. But in fact, you've just used a cheap trick to try to get yourself out from under the burden of having to engage with evidence. So.
Where he arrives in Bethany the night before, it's in the morning, he enters Jerusalem. Mark 13 doesn't even give us the timestamp. You have to do the inference, because the Mount of Olives is meant to be in Jerusalem, where he's been all day in Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night, and so forth. And so they interlock in a way that points to truth. They interlock in a casual, non-deliberate, non-designed way. And furthermore, John actually contradicts Mark on the issue of when exactly Jesus was anointed at Bethany. In Mark, it's after the triumphal entry. In John, it's before. So if John is simply using Mark, then that contradiction seems rather surprising.
Yeah, and one of the things that I keep hearing, I don't know if you fall into this category, but when people point to that where they disagree, I've had a lot of theists tell me that makes them even more strongly convinced. Do you think the part where they disagree does that more strongly convince you?
It depends on the nature of the variation. So there's a phenomenon that I call reconcilable variations, which is when you have two accounts which appear on first blush to contradict one another, but then upon learning some new information or inspecting the accounts more closely, they turn out to actually fit together naturally without straining after all. And in that case, I would argue that is evidence for independence, which indeed is evidence for the reliability of the account.
Yeah, except that you can't make an argument for independence when both people who are writing something have access to the stories ahead of time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it doesn't have to be a Q document. It doesn't have to be another gospel. It could just be, these are the stories that are going around, and this guy wrote this version of the story, and this guy wrote this version of the story. And the source of the particular claims where they claim, it's not coincidental. It is derivative of the oral tradition.
Yeah, so the source idea is something Richard Curie put forward on his blog, responding to the undesigned coincidence argument. And other people have put forward that objection as well. I responded to it quite extensively at my site. I'll just very briefly respond to it here. There's a number of problems with that. One is that often you find intersections between different pericopes in the gospel accounts, and the oral traditions would have corresponded to you wouldn't have an source or oral tradition which contained the entire gospel accounts. So the fact that you have these interlockings between different accounts or different pericopes, different stories, even if it is derivative from earlier oral traditions which predate the Gospels, that would still be an example of an undesigned coincidence, and so it wouldn't refute the argument. It's also ad hoc. It's invoked only to get around the hypothesis of truth, rather than the simplest explanation, which I think is that these events really happened. So there's a number of issues with that. And also evidence for independence, and the particular example I gave.
Let's just pause here before Dillahunty. So you're completely right there, but notice, just again, I want to focus on what Matt is doing here. He said, well, there are stories, they had access to them. Which versions of the stories? Well, to make the claim he's trying to make, they have to be comprehensive enough that everything you find in any of the Gospels can be traced back to these things, and then people are just picking and choosing bits and pieces out of them. But also, the stories, from Matt's point to work, have to be not such as gives them any trustworthy relationship to the actual events. So, do we have this source? No. Do we have any ancient reference to such an source? No. Are the interlockings that we do have of a kind that we find when we know there's not an source out there, even though there are various stories about things, accounts of battles in World War II, for example. Yeah, first-hand accounts written by people who were participants do sometimes dovetail in exactly these ways. They were given before there were comprehensive histories, although yes, people were talking about various things about the war just after the war, but these accounts were written down and published or taken in deposition before there was any book that sort of wove everything together that everybody could have been getting things out of, and those accounts interlock with one another. They also interlock with hard data that we get from non-testimonial sources, as do the Gospels, as does the Book of Acts. So again, this is, do you know what a cargo cult is?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So a Melanesian cargo cult, there were Melanesian islands that the Allied troops stationed air bases on during World War II. And there were natives on these islands who would watch in astonishment as men would go out onto large paved runways and wave sticks and wands, and airplanes would come in, and then they would unload cargo from them, and it was all just wonderful and miraculous. Well, when they left the islands, the natives, of course, remained, and some of them began going out with bamboo wands and waving them in the ways that they had seen people doing, and thinking that they were going to bring in cargo by doing this, because they were doing pretty much the same thing in their minds as the soldiers had been doing. When I see Matt working on these principles, it seems to me that he is doing cargo cult epistemology. He's using some words that are used by people who actually know what they're doing in epistemology, and he's talking with great confidence, and he expects epistemic cargo to come sailing in because he's doing this, but it's actually just a kind of mummer's game. It's not even the real thing, and that is painful to watch.
Yeah, I mean, really, this clip speaks to exactly what you were talking about before. He doesn't have his feet planted anywhere. It's just these bare epistemic possibilities as well. Here's something that's possible, Jonathan, even though you've given something very detailed, very specific, something that would require some scrupulous unpacking, and yet he thinks he can just, I'd say it's almost reminiscent of a certain presentation pitted against undesigned coincidences. It's just kind of a, here's a possibility without any,
right?
Just not even a meager way to pick apart his position. It's like, well, what is it, Matt? What is your theory of literary dependence here? I mean, no clue. I have no clue. It's just.
What's your theory and what's your evidence for it? Right.
Right. Right. Exactly.
It also violates Occam's razor, because Occam's razor says do not multiply causation beyond necessity. And the simplest cause of undesigned coincidences is truth. But so it's a violation of Occam's razor to just arbitrarily invoke sources to try and get around the hypothesis of truth, when truth is your simplest explanation here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I ran across a clip the other day from The Princess Bride, the novel, not the movie, but the novel, which I think is a wonderful passage. See if I can find where I put that. Inigo has been staring at the man in black who is climbing the cliffs of insanity. He's been sailing after them and gaining on them, and now they've gone up the cliffs of insanity, and wow, here's this guy coming up after them, and Inigo basically says, look, he is following us. That's what's happening, that you can't just get around this. And then let's see if I can. I'm having some trouble locating my own feed. Come on now. There we go. Yeah. All right. Here we go. The Sicilian advanced on the Spaniard now, his wild eyes glittering at the insubordination. I have the keenest mind that has ever been turned to unlawful pursuits, he began. So when I tell you something, it is not guesswork, it is fact. And the fact is that the man in black is not following us. A more logical explanation would be that he is simply an ordinary sailor who dabbles in mountain climbing as a hobby, who happens to have the same general final destination as we do. That certainly satisfies me, and I hope it satisfies you. I love that passage because it's a great illustration of exactly the point that merely bringing up a bare possibility and then saying, oh, and then this could do it, doesn't really do any epistemic work. And it is the refuge of people who don't understand the argument from undesigned coincidences. Well, maybe it was like this. And then if you push them on that, sometimes they'll just say, well, this is plausible. Is it plausible? Have you provided a reason to think that it's plausible? What is your argument that your explanation is plausible? And one never, of course, gets to that argument because that argument generally doesn't exist. But that's the way that people move who want to avoid having to engage with non-deductive evidence. They really don't understand what's going on, and they want to pretend that they do. And this kind of a train wreck is the result.
John and Mark.
Yeah, it's a. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, and when it comes to inductive cases, cumulative arguments, and these very specific evidences, it does take time. It does take time, I think, to really grab hold of the power of some of these little points. Like, it's, before I'd say when I was maybe more in the minimalist camp, it wouldn't have struck me as much then that Luke knew there were sycamore trees in Jericho, right? But now that I know that, and now that I knew that Luke knew that, and he detailed it meticulously, knowing that sycamore trees were specific to Jericho and not specific to other regions in the Mediterranean, it's very gripping. But here we just have someone who's not even trying to understand.
Issues with that. And also evidence for independence. And the particular example I gave in Mark and John, I would argue that John and Mark are reporting independently on that particular issue.
And I still don't see how that makes any difference, because are we suggesting that someone who we consider truthful couldn't also be honestly mistaken or even actively lying about a secondary statement?
Well, it provides evidence that they are...
That's not my question.
No, listen to me. Cumulatively provides evidence that the authors of the Gospels and Acts are close up to the facts, and that they have reliable access to information, and that they're habitually truthful.
No, it doesn't. It shows that they at least had access to the same story. Whether they have access to the same story because they heard the same story or because they are actually witnesses of the same story are two independent things. But even if they were witnesses writing what they think happened, that does not mean that their attempt to be honest and accurate means that we have good access to what the facts are. This is what, how many people have been falsely convicted because somebody was absolutely convinced that that's the person that attacked them? Okay, we're not talking about like the eyewitness testimony that you decided just to shrug off. I'm saying if I find someone, like, I won't use you, we'll stick with my mom. My mom is absolutely, I'm convinced most of the time, sometimes she lies. I'm convinced most of the time she is actively trying to tell me the truth. The problem is that when she tells me what she's convinced of, and I ask, what's the reason that you're convinced of it? She doesn't present arguments. She doesn't present evidence. It is trusting. And that's exactly what you seem to be arguing for here, that we have these accounts in the gospel, and the gospel authors are otherwise trustworthy, and therefore we should take their word for it when they report that someone was raised from the dead. Now, I will never, ever accept that as a good reason to believe that somebody was raised from the dead. But if the story is in fact true, then it seems to me we should, if there's a God, have access to much better evidence so that you don't have to come to me and say, hey, look, I really researched these gospels, and this one said this, and this one said this. It has nothing to do with the resurrection. I think these guys are trying to be honest. I think they're telling the story as best we can. This is the best evidence that we have. Well, if the best evidence we have is still insufficient to demonstrate the likely truth of the proposition, and for resurrection, our priors are not minimal. They're zero. Apart from the Bible claiming that Jesus also.
So I think maybe we should stop here because
that's exactly what I was bringing up before. He's acting as if you're making a beeline with every data point to the resurrection when you're painting the canvas. You know, you're not just, you didn't just draw the cross on there.
I'm sure Dr. McGrew wants to comment on the prior probability of the resurrection not being minimal, but zero.
I do, and before we get to that, I want to read, so this is a quotation from Joseph Butler's book, The Analogy of Religion, which was first written in 1736. And I think it's appropriate to bring it up here just to show that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Here's this passage from Part 2, Chapter 7 of The Analogy of Religion. The truth of our religion, like the truth of common matters, is to be judged of by all the evidence taken together. And unless the whole series of things which may be alleged in this argument, and every particular thing in it can reasonably be supposed to have been by accident, for here the stress of the argument for Christianity lies, then is the truth of it proved in like manner as if in any common case numerous events acknowledged were to be alleged in proof of any other disputed. The truth of the disputed event would be proved, and here he doesn't mean mathematically, but probabilistically, not only if any one of the acknowledged ones did of itself clearly imply it, but though no one of them singly did, if the whole of the acknowledged events taken together could not in reason be supposed to have happened unless the disputed one were true. And now get this, and think about what we're facing right here. It is obvious how much advantage the nature of this evidence gives to those persons who attack Christianity, especially in conversation. For it is easy to show in a short and lively manner that such and such things are liable to objection, that this and another thing is of little weight in itself, but impossible to show in like manner the united force of the argument in one view. Mic drop, 18th century style. There is just no way to show the united force of the evidence in a short and lively manner, whereas you can always object to this or that or the other thing and say, oh, by itself, this piece or that piece doesn't prove anything. Fair enough. But notice when you said it provides evidence, his response was, that's not my question. Yeah, that's right, because your question was stupid. You were trying to say, did it prove that? That's irrelevant. Nobody's claiming it does, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't. That doesn't mean you've engaged with the evidence. It doesn't mean you've dismissed the evidence in a reasonable fashion. And now on to the zero probability. So is there any further evidence in this clip as we go on as to why he says the probability is zero? Or are we left just to conjecture?
No, we're just left just to conjecture.
So I'm trying to think, does he even know what it means for an event to have probability zero? Because it sounds to me like he's trying to say, if an event is unprecedented, then it has probability zero because it has occurred 0 times so far. But every event is unprecedented if we describe it in a sufficient amount of detail. I have never had a discussion of a Dillahunty debate with someone who has just gone through surgery within the past 2 weeks, but here I am having it. Does the fact that that's unprecedented mean its probability is 0 and so it's not happening now? No, not at all. Every event is unprecedented if you get down to describing it in a sufficient amount of detail. And if we don't have to do that, if we're just allowed to pick the level of generality we like, then we can describe the resurrection in general terms as an event that was brought about by a cause sufficient to bring about that event. And then it's one of a almost countless host of events of that level of generality which have happened before. So the level at which we're describing this makes a difference, which means that simply saying I can find a level at which I'm describing it for which this is unprecedented is a lousy way to try to set a probability. That just doesn't work. Richard Carrier tries to do this. Matt Dillahunty tries to do this. These guys just don't understand how probability works.
Yeah.
And sorry,
go ahead, Jonathan.
I would argue that you can in fact raise the prior probability of the resurrection hypothesis by, number one, showing that God exists, because if God exists, then the prior probability is higher than, if you've demonstrated God exists, the prior probability of the resurrection is higher than it otherwise would be. And second, you can raise the prior probability by showing, and I'm borrowing a phrase from William Lane Craig here, developing the theo-historical context of the resurrection. Because when we look at the Gospels, we see what I call instances of Messianic convergence, which is to say that you find instances in the Gospel accounts which not only enjoy strong evidential historical support, but also correlate or correspond to the Old Testament in very striking ways. For instance, Jesus' death happening to coincide with the Jewish feast of Passover on Nisan 15th. That is something which is quite striking, and it seems to be more probable on the hypothesis of Christianity than on its false. It doesn't prove Christianity, but it is evidence, I think, or evidence that is more probable on the hypothesis of Christianity than on its falsehood. Another example is the fact that Christianity becomes the dominant global religion that it becomes, especially in view of the persecution that Christians were subjected to until 313 AD with the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan guaranteed religious freedom, but prior to that date, Christians were persecuted, and it seemed that the probability of Christianity becoming such an international global religion was very, very small. But on the hypothesis that Christianity is true, well, you have the Old Testament prophecies like Isaiah 49, Isaiah 42, which describes the Messiah as the light to the Gentiles who will bring God's salvation to the ends of the earth. You have Jesus himself in the gospel. In the Gospels, he says that this message of salvation will be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. And so on the hypothesis that Christianity is true, then the probability of Christianity becoming such an international global religion is actually relatively high. And so that, again, would be another layer of that sort of Messianic convergence, or Jesus' birth in Bethlehem is another example which correlates with Micah 5, which would be which seems unlikely to be engineered, and so forth. And as you compile those these evidences cumulatively, you can start to deduce that God may well have plausible motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead, because the Old Testament predicts that the Messiah will be raised from the dead. Isaiah 53 predicts that, and you have these instances of Messianic convergence in the Gospels, which I think cumulatively raise the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus.
Right. So now here's a funny point. If the prior probability were 0, it would be impossible to raise that probability. Probabilities of 0 in Bayesian epistemology are sticky, like probability of 1. A 0 probability event cannot be given a probability greater than 0 by any amount of evidence. So curiously, when he says the probability is actually 0 here, Matt is locking himself into the position that evidence doesn't matter. Now, I want in Charity to believe that he doesn't actually think evidence doesn't matter, but he can't have it both ways. If evidence matters, the probability is not 0. If the probability is 0, further evidence is irrelevant. It would be like trying to adduce empirical evidence for the existence of square circles. It just doesn't work. You can't increase the probability of an impossibility. You can't increase the probability of a 0 probability event. And if you understand Bayes' theorem, you can see simply why when you try to do that, you end up multiplying through and there's just this 0 hanging there, which is going to render your final result 0. So you can't make this happen. And I mean, what a mess. In a sense, though, I think that Matt is here at least revealing something, and that is that he doesn't really think in the end that this is about the evidence. It was never about the evidence. It wasn't that you had some evidence, he could kind of see where you were going, but he just didn't quite think it was enough. For a long time, Antony Flew was in that position. For a long time, he said, okay, you guys have something better going than we have going for any other religious movement in the world. The resurrection of Jesus is like the best shot for it. I just don't think it quite works. But I kind of see where you're going. I just don't think you have enough evidence. All right, you can have a discussion with somebody like that. But Matt, like David Hume, seems to really be coming from the perspective that it just doesn't matter. Whatever you got, I'm going to say it's not enough. And anybody can say anything, but that doesn't mean he's got an argument.
This might illuminate why earlier in the debate I asked him what would change his mind in principle about the resurrection. And he said he doesn't know what would change his mind, because if he says the probability is 0, then it's no wonder that he doesn't know of any evidence that would change his mind.
Yeah.
I was going to say, even if we don't interpret Matt in the most radical terms with respect to his 0 probability comment, it's so crippling to Matt, and I mean, honestly, even Christian apologists and scholars who don't understand and appreciate the ability for some sort of even meager, scant type of evidence, as long as it's specific, to overturn some sort of antecedent improbability. And I mean, if we interpret Matt in his most radical terms, then that doesn't even matter. But it's just it's just very crippling. But again, I think we've all agreed that it's not something that he's earnestly seeking to understand, but just I think it's pretty clear that, it's he wants to save face. He wants to come off as right, and typically that just means being domineering during the conversation. And like you said, Tim, using just enough jargon to sound like you know what you're talking about, but fumbling it well before you get to the goal line.
So raised the dead, for which we have no evidence of that either. Do you think that the dead crawled out of their graves and marched on Jerusalem?
This is the problem with a lot of these conversational debates, especially with someone of Dillahunty's personality, that he makes all these bogus claims like the probability of the resurrection is 0, and then he, after making a lot of bogus claims like that, then he asks you a question, so you don't have opportunity to go back and address the bogus claims that he just made.
Right, that's just an MO. And that I think comes from his time as the host of the Atheist Experience, where he gets to set the rules and he gets to interrupt people, and he's basically loading a bunch of nonsense up in front and then asks you a question. If you don't answer the question, it sounds like you're avoiding the question. But if you answer the question first up, then all the nonsense he just said is allowed not exactly to be acknowledged, but to stand unrefuted while you're trying to answer the question. So it's a real debater's trick. It's a heads I win, tails you lose kind of situation. And I don't really know, practically speaking, whether there's an effective way to address it. Maybe the best one could do would be to say, yeah, everything you just said is false, but now on to your question. But the minute you say that, he's going to interrupt you and say, no, it's not false, right? And then we're into one of these iterations of the Monty Python argument clinic, right? It's not an argument, it's simple contradiction. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't.
I wanted to ask you guys now, I might be stepping on some toes here, not you guys' toes, so our listeners can tuck their feet in if they'd like, but I almost wonder if Matt's experiences with other Christian scholars and apologists that approach really conditioned him to be even more dismissive of specific lines of evidence, because that's not really usually what he's used to getting. his other debates, and I'm not into this, but he's often he's left to debate explanations of, alleged facts, whether or not they were agreed upon by the consensus, whatever, that doesn't really matter. But I think he's used to debating explanations as opposed to specific lines of evidence. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah,
I don't know enough about the overall scope of Dillahunty's debates to be able to say. I do know that he's had some experience of debating presuppositionalists, and he no doubt has had reason to feel very satisfied coming away from those discussions. But there, it's not even, explanations. It's instead an entire, again, forgive me, but an invented epistemology, this time from the Christian side, being brought in to try to snow the other person into subjection. In fact, there is a certain amount of resemblance between Matt's approach and the approach that at least some, I will not say all, presuppositionalists take when they're engaging with evidentialists. That's a sad thought. Wow.
Yeah, I think that Dillahunty's epistemology could be likened to it's almost the presuppositionalism of atheism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know he's Mike Lacona on the resurrection, a couple other apologists who've just presented a sort of a minimal facts case, and I just almost wonder if that's conditioned him in such a way where Jonathan confused him in a way, in a sense, like, well, what is this? I mean,
That's interesting. So not what he was used to, not what he was expecting, something more specific, and therefore out of his wheelhouse, and he's trying to treat it as though it were a minimal facts approach rather than a more maximal data approach, which Jonathan was actually using. That is certainly possible.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could say with confidence, but that is, I see now the plausibility of what you're saying.
It was certainly clear that Matt had never heard of the maximal data approach to the resurrection. Okay, let's continue.
Do you think that all of these other supernatural things happen where where do you draw the line on, hey, and someone I consider, who I've never met, but someone who I consider to be a reliable witness is telling me about a miracle? How do you reject all the claims of the spirit men from other religions who claim that they don't eat food, that they live off prana, and they have acolytes, and they have people who are willing disciples of them, who follow them around? Now, you can't test them. How do you say that those people aren't tied to the facts, and yet the ones you're citing are?
So the point is, if the Gospels and Acts are based on eyewitness testimony, then we have to take seriously that what they say concerning the nature, variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus goes back to the early apostolic eyewitnesses. And then that's what needs to be explained by looking at sifting through the hypotheses I offered. Namely, Matt's basically asking me, how can we tell the difference between the miracle claim, namely the resurrection that you accept, and the miracle claims in other religions that you don't accept? But that was been the whole point of my argument throughout the whole debate. So obviously I'm just going to repeat what the whole argument has been. He doesn't seem to have grasped what's being said.
Right. So I would say there's, so good, Richard, you go.
I was just going to say, that's exactly what you're like. He's saying, they're not tied to the facts. Just like, here you are tying your case to the facts, and he's asking you about other people, other religious claims, and why they're not tied to the facts. Well, okay, Matt, we can talk about them on their terms, but here I am trying to fasten Christianity down firmly with multiple lines of evidence, and you're asking me about other religions. Okay, yeah. This is, like you said, this isn't about evidence.
Yeah, the answer is we do it by the evidence, and that's what I've been trying to get you to engage with this entire time, and completely fruitlessly. You just won't do it. But there's a different way of approaching this that might also be of some value, which is to say, Matt, there are kinds of reasons for doubting some claims. We may doubt that a certain event has occurred when the first claim that it occurred happens only long after the event in question. We may doubt a claim that an event has occurred when the first claim that has occurred takes place only at a very great distance from the place where it has occurred. We may reasonably doubt that an event has occurred when it's not the kind of thing that men's outward senses, their eyes and their ears, can attest. We may, so there are all these filters that we can put this through. And a lot of the claims that are promulgated in various religious traditions, and this includes some of the ecclesiastical miracle claims from the Middle Ages within the Christian tradition, don't fare well when you try to put them through the filter. And I am certainly not going to say, this is one in my religious tradition, therefore I will accept it without question. No, actually, I think it's very important that we test everything and hold on tightly to what is good. So besides the perfectly reasonable approach of laying out all of this evidence, there is also the approach of saying, some of these things don't even get off the ground initially, but the gospel accounts do. And here are various criteria of that sort. So there are a couple of good books, and Jonathan, maybe if you'd like, in the YouTube channel, you can put in links. I'll give you links where people can download these, but Charles Leslie's Short and Easy Method with the Deists and John Douglas's book, The Criterion, both go through this kind of approach in addition to talking about specific evidence. So maybe for some people, that would be a helpful way of looking at what's going on there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And it argues against the myth hypothesis, and then we have to consider, okay, were they honestly mistaken or were they deliberately lying? And the fact that they're substantially trustworthy is evidence that they were not deliberately lying, although it's not conclusive proof, but is evidence for that conclusion. You could also look at the fact that the apostles were willing to die as martyrs for their testimony, which also contributes evidence to the fact that they were not deliberately lying about what they allegedly saw.
I just asked you how you distinguish between the people who you think you're being honest and have access to the facts for the religion that you accept, how you distinguish between those and the people who are making claims for other religions that you don't accept. And instead of giving me anything close to how you would tell the difference, which is what epistemology is about, how I tell the difference between, hey, this religion, you're basically saying these religious accounts are true and these religious accounts over here are not true, and you have no better evidence for your truth than they have for theirs. Because what you have is a claim from someone who you find truthful. Now, are you just going to say that for all those other religions or for those other supernatural accounts, you just don't find those people truthful?
Stop right there.
Oh.
Notice what he just did. He just took all of the evidence you've given and he put it into soft focus and pretended that what you had said is, I find this person credible, no reasons given. Whereas what you were actually saying is, look at all of the different lines of evidence we have that point to this person's being well-informed and habitually truthful. And none of that penetrated. It's just like the frontal cortex is not being engaged here. None of that penetrated. And it just all sounds to him, or he's pretending that it all sounds to him, like, you believe this guy and not that guy. This is not somebody with whom you can have a profitable discussion of evidence, because either he's unwilling to engage with evidence or he's just not smart enough to get the point. And I really don't want either of those conclusions. It's unkind to draw either of those conclusions, but he's really not giving us a lot of choice here.
Notice also, too, what he did. He saddled you with the burden of demonstrating your case, but also mounting a case against competing religions when this is supposed to be about the resurrection. It's like, okay, Matt, I mean, again, we can do that. I'm not saying that you can't compare and contrast in a debate, but it's just this rapid fire demand of his, which, again, detracts from what you're actually doing, which is what he asked you to do. And yet, like you said, Tim, he's just, like, I don't want to be unkind, but he's too dense to understand that that's precisely what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, then I don't find yours truthful, and there's no point in having a debate because we no longer give a damn about epistemology. We're just going to go with how our gut feels, right?
That was a pretty good summary of the debate, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to look at the evidence, and when
I've been asking for evidence. Do you have any evidence that doesn't come from the Bible?
No,
Okay. So you have nothing but a hearsay account from an unidentifiable source.
we have evidence from the New Testament, including Paul and the Apostles and so forth.
Yeah.
So why don't you start responding to the evidence rather than just dismissing it?
It's not evidence. It's claims, not evidence. There is no evidence. There is no physical evidence. There is no. What you can do is you can say that there are people who wrote stories and you find them compelling, and I don't.
If you're just going to keep dismissing the evidence, then we're done.
Yes, we are. We are. And you know whose fault it is? The God that you believe in, because the God that you believe in is too stupid to understand that when he presents something in a way where it's indistinguishable from other things that are false, that's the end of the conversation. I didn't make up the rules about what counts as evidence.
So at this point, I just got so fed up with him constantly not responding to anything I was saying and just going off on red herrings and throwing out a bunch of errors and asking a question to try to get round having to actually defend what he just said, that I hung up on him, just as he does on the atheist experience.
Ego te absolva filius meus. Right? I understand. I get it. There's somebody who's too stupid to understand epistemology here, and it's not God.
Yeah.
All right, let's continue.
No, I don't. I mean, he's definitely not here, but I don't know if
I heard him say we're done.
I don't know if it was. I'd be surprised if it was a raid.
I'm pretty sure he just quit because I'm not going to accept the stories from his book while he's not giving me any reason why he's rejecting the stories from other people's books. So I guess we can take questions.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll jump into the Q&A.
This is what happens. This is what happens, by the way, when you debate someone who you've had blocked for a while, who repeatedly suggests.
By the way, I don't know what he's alluding to there. I wasn't aware that he'd blocked me, so I don't know what he's talking about there.
That you're running.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the point where something substantive happens, if there is such a point.
Yeah, so they take a few questions and then I come back and we continue discussing.
And then you only take the low-hanging fruit, and then you come into a debate and they decide to make themselves look like the low-hanging fruit that, Jonathan could have just called the show and saved me a bunch of time. But I guess we'll go with questions.
Okay, thanks for your question. Coming in from Smoky Saint. I think this is something from their debate the other night, an inside joke. Wizard words is a thing now. Deal with it. I have no idea what that means, but we hope you're well, Smoky. And Lori Nicola, thanks for your question, said, evidence was in the title of this video. I don't know. I think maybe they're just referring to the fact that the actual title was strong evidence. That's true. We do shorten the title, folks. That's just because it makes it easier where people can see the whole title on their mobile device. And so, yes, it is true that strong evidence is the official title. Pants L. Jones, thanks for your question, said, let's see.
Yeah, if I can jump in for just a second. I didn't even notice that. Yeah, the title of the video that we're streaming says evidence, but the agreed upon topic beforehand was strong evidence. Because if somebody came to me and said, hey, there's evidence for the resurrection, I'm not dumb enough to say, no, there's not, because I understand anecdotal evidence is still evidence. Bad evidence is still evidence. Garbage evidence is still evidence. Evidence that rises to the level of curiosity but isn't sufficient to actually result in belief soundly, still evidence.
But question, but what happened to claims aren't evidence? Because what outside of the writings of the New Testament is he willing to accept? I mean, I know you didn't bring up, numismatic evidence and inscriptions and so on and so forth, but this sounds entirely in tension with his claims are not evidence.
Also notice it's in tension with his claim that the probability of the resurrection is 0.
Right, yeah.
So now he can't actually consistently do that.
Correct, yeah. I think you had it right, Tim, when you framed it very well in our group chat, what you thought he meant. He probably didn't mean it in the most extreme terms, but yeah, you're exactly right. So again, someone who's mishandling terms left and right, but claims to be the epistemology master here.
You know what needs to be done? Somebody, if anybody actually wants to engage with Matt, they need to do a written discussion. Yeah. Make him write these claims down. Because he can't interrupt you while you're writing. Make him do it in writing. And then call him out on point after point after point. Written discussions are a much better way of getting at the truth anyway. So go ahead.
And in this case, Jonathan thought there was strong evidence, and yet he comes with nothing but anonymous accounts from a book that he likes.
Okay, Hunter Bailey, thanks for your question, said, Matt, regarding, quote, hearsay, unquote, how do you account for the historical present found in Mark? And they put in parentheses, accounts for the vividness of the text, especially small details which are most understood as reflecting eyewitness memory.
Well, so this is another thing where we're basically asking the same question. So it's like, how do you account for someone writing this particular thing in the gospel? And my account for it is that almost certainly they believed they were reporting something that was factual. That is independent from whether or not they were accurate on the facts. And so, you know, I didn't even, there were things that I was prepared to talk about. So.
Can I bring something? Just more. Notice how he said, the questioner said, Matt, you know, more or less, how do you account for when they're getting the facts right? And he brings up his rebuttal is, well, that's independent of whether they're getting the facts right. It's like, okay, I mean, Matt, at what point can we sit down and show you how fantastic a historian Luke was, how detailed Matthew can be? I mean, he's just got this impenetrable force field in his arsenal that just won't allow those sorts of things in. It has to be monumental for Matt, and his idea of monumental evidence presumably is just anachronistic. If I remember the beginning of the debate correctly, he doesn't want to accept the exact type of evidence we should accept from historical documents. It has to be forensic, or didn't he say DNA at one point?
Right.
Like, let's get real here, Matt. Seriously, this is yeah.
16, we didn't talk about the fact that the last 11 verses or so of Mark are added on after the fact. Mark 16 ends at verse 8 in the oldest manuscripts, and it just says, trembling and bewildered, the women fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then immediately, there's a new verse there that says, hey, when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons, and she went and told those. So there's this problem, a serious problem with the ending of Mark. Now, I don't know what the explanation is. I don't know if it was a 3rd or 4th century interpolation where somebody added that to Mark. But the fact is that the oldest gospel that we know of has the first 8 verses of its final chapter, chapter 16, basically tells the story that, Jesus, and the stone's been rolled away and Jesus is risen, hurrah, end of story. There was nothing there about the Great Commission. And what got added was not only the Great Commission, but it's this, hey, if you want to know who's a true believer, these are the signs that accompany them. They can drive out demons, they speak in tongues, they can pick up snakes with their hands, they can drink deadly poison. All that stuff ends up in Mark. And if you're going to talk about the author of the Gospel of Mark being trustworthy, you have to at least say, all right, it's trustworthy up to 16:8, and then everything, 9 through 20 in chapter 16 is no longer trustworthy. But now you're taking the published book that may or may not be trustworthy, and you are deciding what portions of it are accurate and which portions of it are not, with no evidence, no ways to investigate it. The only evidence that you have is to come in and say, hey, oh, Jonathan's back. The only evidence you have is to come in and say, hey, we know that if you handle venomous snakes, you're probably going to get bitten at some point. You're probably going to die. And so that's what's happened over and over again. I'm back.
Gotcha.
I'm back. I just said it was fine. The fact of the matter is, in these sorts of interactions, I interrupt people. I think Jonathan interrupted me at least once too. I know I'm more prone to it than other. I get the frustration. But at the end of the day, if the foundation of how we determine what is strong evidence or what is sufficient evidence is just, I'm going to accept that this person's truthful and telling me the truth, and you're not, well, then why are we bothering to have a discussion? Because if we can't...
But I presented evidence, and Matt Dillahunty failed to interact or engage with the evidence that was presented.
That's criminally misrepresenting what has happened. It is excusable only on the supposition that he's just too stupid to see what's going on. That's ridiculous.
Beyond that, we're stuck.
Okay. I didn't see that we were making much progress in the discussion because you didn't seem to really get the concept of an inductive argument.
Oh my God. Should I rage quit now because you're calling me stupid, pretending that I don't know what an inductive argument is? Well, science is entirely inductive. I've given this lecture 100 times.
Well, I was making the case for the substantial trustworthy of the Gospels based on an inductive argument, which you didn't seem to, you just dismissed. But just because it's right over here doesn't mean it's right over here. And I completely accept that. But there's an inductive argument for the substantial trustworthiness of the Gospel accounts, and indeed they're grounding in the testimony of credible eyewitnesses.
If the most trustworthy person you know came to you and said, I was just abducted by aliens, carried off to another planet, impregnated, cloned, and delivered back here, and I have no other evidence for it, do you take their word for it?
Oops, sorry. No, we wouldn't take their word for it.
Okay. What if 5 people said that?
We need to look at the particulars of the case. So we need to look at, okay, so what's the nature of what's being claimed? We need to look at the hypothesis that they were sincerely wrong. We'd have to look at the possibility that they were deliberately lying, and we'd have to evaluate those hypotheses on a case-by-case basis. So we need to know more about the particulars of the case before we could adjudicate such things.
I agree. What are the particulars of the case that we can make an argument that any resurrection has ever occurred? What evidence do we have?
You've just been giving him the particulars of the case over and over and over and over and over in more detail than you probably should even be asked to do in a verbal debate. And he's not going to get it. He's still not going to get it. He's committed to not getting it.
We have the fact that we have the evidence that the apostles claimed Jesus rose from the dead. We have that from Paul.
Those are claims.
Yeah, and this is where I dispute your distinction that you want to make between claims and evidence, Matt.
Okay, but aren't the people who, if you're going to say, so you haven't done anything, this is why I asked the question, how do you distinguish the claims that you're willing to accept from the ones that you reject? And so I tried with other religions, and that didn't go very well. And then I tried with an alien abduction story, and that's still not going well, because what you're coming back with is just more of, you are convinced that these people are telling the truth. You're not convinced that the alien abduction people are telling the truth, but you have no foundation for suggesting that they're not.
That's willful. That is willful. There's no excuse for that.
Particulars of the case, right? So we have to know, okay, so are these substantially trustworthy witnesses? We have to look at, okay, would they be likely to lie about this? We need to look at, would they be, could they have been honestly mistaken? Could this be a dream that they're trying to relate or something like along those lines?
I agree with all of that.
And also, yeah,
genuinely.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You could also look at the prior probability. I mean, alien spacecraft, given the hugeness of the universe, right? So the sun is 93 million miles away. The next nearest star, Alpha Centauri, is 26 trillion miles away, and there's about 200 billion stars in our galaxy, and about 200 billion galaxies in our universe. The prior probability of any alien spacecraft making it to Earth is vanishingly small, right?
No, I'm not necessarily convinced it's vanishingly small. The Drake equation shows the likelihood. I don't think we've been visited by aliens at all. However, no matter how small it is, because it is a natural event that doesn't make any sort of appeal to anything beyond the natural world, how can we not determine that a natural explanation that posits nothing particularly that would violate the laws of physics is somehow less likely than something that does violate the laws of nature as we understand them? And when we have, like, if I were to ask...
The well is poisoned. Oh.
There we go again, right? This is the
arm
wrestling contest between science and testimony, and science wins. And
how many resurrections, not just I had a heart attack and somebody used the paddles, but like, boom, we're going to call you dead, we're going to bury you for a couple of days, and then you're back. How many of those have we ever scientifically verified in the entire history of the world?
Time. Look at what he's doing. He's appealing to a frequentist conception now. He's going to say that if you have 0 scientifically monitored, attested resurrections with modern scientists on hand to verify it, then that means that the probability is 0. He may not recur to that phrase, but I'm going to just go out on a limb and say, I bet that's where he's getting it. And that is so beside the point. And the whole violation of the laws of nature thing, even J.L. Mackie, who wrote an entire book called The Miracle of Theism, playing off of the end of Hume's essay of Miracles, where he's mocking Christianity. Even Mackie sees that the Christians are not maintaining that the laws of nature are false if miracles occur. They're merely maintaining that the universe isn't causally closed. But Matt doesn't seem to have got the memo.
Of supernatural events?
I don't care whether it's supernatural or not. I don't care how the resurrection supposedly happened. This is the mistake that Lacona made when we were doing this debate, is he goes on and tries to demonstrate that reality has a supernatural realm. That's irrelevant. How many times throughout history has someone been verifiably dead, medically determined to be dead, buried for a couple of days, and then comes back to life that we can actually verify?
Hey, I'm so sorry. You were cutting out a lot there. I think it's at your end. I think you're back now.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Again. Yes, I can. Mm-hmm.
Sure. How many times in history have we scientifically verified a resurrection?
Well, what do you mean by scientifically?
Have we shown this person was definitely dead for several days, and then is now alive again? How many times has that happened that we can verify?
I would say one that we can verify, and that would be Jesus.
And I would say 0, because there's absolutely nothing about a handful of first century books claiming that it happened that provides any sort of scientific evidence that it did happen.
Okay, notice the shift now to quote unquote scientific evidence, right? As opposed to we could show. Now he wants scientific evidence, and he's going to load that up, I'll predict, with a bunch of things that he knows you can't have in ordinary historical testimony, however good the historical testimony is. The question is not whether there are scientists standing there with video cameras and DNA tests. That's just a ridiculous way to approach the whole question.
Yeah, and I mean, given his approach, I guess so much the worse for your more observational sciences. I mean, let's throw out half of astronomy, and I mean, it's just, I don't know. Does at any point, I mean, even if it's not in this debate, does he ever mention to anyone's recollection what he does accept as a historically reliable document or a historically veridical claim that he's willing to accept? I mean, does it tend to just be the major ones? Or I'm just curious.
He says that physical evidence is the only strong type of evidence, so presumably it would have to be something corroborated by physical evidence.
But why is physical evidence supposed to be so strong?
Right.
I'm not trying to be dense here, but physical evidence over the centuries has been shown to be interpretable in multiple ways. It's not like physical evidence is always unequivocal. I'll give you just one example from the history of science. When Michelson and Morley tried to check for the drift of the Earth through the ether and couldn't come up with it, they took that result to be verifying one theory of the ether, according to which the ether would, I mean, there were two theories. On one of them, the ether would flow around the Earth, and on the other, the ether would flow through the Earth. The flow through the Earth should have given them a result that was not a null result. They didn't get that, so they took it that Stokes's view of the ether was the correct view of the ether. Subsequently, people following in Einstein's footsteps took it as evidence that there was no ether at all. If that experiment had been done in the early 17th century, people would have used it as evidence against Galileo for the claim that the Earth isn't moving after all. Same physical evidence, multiple possible interpretations. How do we determine what the best explanation is? Well, that involves a lot of factors that we use as we survey inference to the best explanation anywhere, and part of that is coherence with our background knowledge. Part of that is the level of likelihood that we have for the evidence according to particular background hypotheses. But this problem arises with physical evidence in the hard sciences just as much as it does in any other human endeavor. Merely separating out claims as though those were not the basis for our knowing what physical evidence is in all but the most direct of personal examinations. Or what do I know what the physical evidence for quantum theory is? Well, I read a bunch of claims. Shall I dismiss the claims now? How do I know what happens in biological systems? Oh, this is the Krebs cycle. How do I know? You just have a book where there's some claims about it. I haven't gone and investigated the matter myself, done the experiments. For all I know, if I'm taking Matt's perspective, their claims about how we synthesize ATP could be as crazy as claims about mythical deities having descended from heaven without, if they're just claims are claims. This is so crazy. This is so crazy.
How do you, since you think there's one and I think there's zero, and by the way, even if you think there's one, does that mean that Lazarus wasn't raised from the dead?
No, you gave the qualifier that can be verified, right? I would argue that there's indirect evidence that Lazarus was raised from the dead.
Wait, you think there's indirect evidence that Lazarus was raised?
Yeah.
And direct evidence that Jesus was raised, and you're convinced that Jesus is God and raised Lazarus, but you don't think there's evidence? Why is the evidence for Jesus' resurrection somehow scientific and the Lazarus one isn't?
Notice what happened right there. How is it somehow scientific? And that qualifier clearly applies to the word evidence. There's historical evidence for a claim that is a physical claim, which could have been empirically detected, yes, and which was empirically detected by people, which is the way that lots of empirical things are detected. But now he throws this scientifically in, and I hear echoes of DNA testing in the background again. It's like, how do you even reason with such a person? You don't, is the answer.
Yeah, so the issue with Lazarus, so I think we have indirect evidence insofar as there's an inductive argument from the substantial trustworthiness of the Gospel of John, which provides the prima facie basis for trusting things for which we do not have direct. In the case of the resurrection of Jesus, I would argue that the evidence for that is substantially stronger than it is for Lazarus because of the number of witnesses we have for that. With Lazarus, we only have a single witness, that would be John. With the resurrection, we have the Pauline corpus, we have the Book of Acts, we have the Gospels, and so forth. And I think that we have good reason so from Paul, we have good reason to think that the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, 12, were claimed witnesses of the resurrection. And we also have the Book of Acts, which substantiates that as well. We have the Gospels. And we also have evidence pertaining to the empty tomb as well. For example, the fact that the tomb was discovered empty by women.
You say that you say the fact that the tomb was discovered empty by women. That's not a fact. That's a claim.
That it was reported as empty by women. And I'm sure you're very familiar with the argument that the argument from embarrassment, namely that it seems unlikely that they would have made female witnesses the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. If they were making up the story, they would have had male witnesses. Now, again, it doesn't prove.
Yes, I find that asinine. That's like saying, if I were the type of person who commit this crime, I would never leave evidence that might in any way suggest that I did it. It's nonsense. It is a big red herring. That's not the way we should be determining what likely happened. We would have never.
In the first century, undermined their credibility.
No, but it doesn't matter. You're basically saying that it somehow amplifies their credibility because if we were making the story up, we would have picked a dude to say it. But how genius does it have to be to pull a double bluff and say, you know what, they're not going to expect this coming from a woman, and then we get to claim, why would we say that women do it?
So basically, Dillahunty is arguing that the disciples invented the story about women discovering the empty tomb so as to fool future historians. That's the argument.
That's a first. I missed that when I saw this live. I mean, just think about the ridiculous psychologizing that is going on right now outside of the clear bucking up of the historical argument, which has, quite a strong backing. I mean, never heard that one before. That was precious.
So what he's basically saying, either he's saying they made it up to fool future historians, or he's saying they're claiming that people who would be considered to be less credible witnesses were the witnesses, could be taken as some kind of contemporaneous head fake that they could do on first century Christian or Jewish, I should say, audiences and first century Roman audiences. And that, if there's something asinine here, that's it. That's the claim. That's like saying, I'm going to make a claim about fairies, but I'm going to put it in the mouth of someone who suffers from perpetual hallucinations. That'll really fool him. Does he even hear himself? What?
I would say it's funny too, is because this little stream of thought now it pigeonholes him, having to explain why. Why would they do that, Matt? What's going on? Again, just this. It's anything to score a point. It's anything to look like a rebuttal has been made.
Freaking genius, except that it doesn't prove
Yeah,
it.
I don't really buy the explanation that they were trying to fool future historians by
I don't either.
Yeah, which is what basically you're trying to say. Because in the first century,
that's not what I'm trying to say.
In the patriarchal society of ancient Palestine, especially in the first century, it actually undermined their credibility rather than support it. Now, I'm not saying, just to be clear, I'm not saying that it proves the existence of the empty tomb. I'm saying it's evidence for it.
No, it's not.
Next, we'll go.
Monty Python Argument Clinic strikes again.
That's just a claim, Matt.
Yeah. Back it up.
Serious.
If you guys had any final points, otherwise we'll. Oh, that's right. We do actually have the 5-minute closings as well before the Q&A, and so if you guys would like to do those, we can do that. Otherwise, if you have any last final open discussion points, we can do that too.
I'll just say that I don't have anything to add in a particular closing, and Jonathan can close if he wants to, and I'm fine with taking questions.
Thanks again for listening. I've been Jonathan McLatchie, and I've been in conversation with Dr. Timothy McGrew and Richard Porter concerning my recent debate with atheist Matt Dillahunty. Stay tuned for part 4, in which we will continue our analysis of Matt's faulty epistemology and acquaintance with New Testament scholarship.